It was the final day of the actual trial, and the fate of what happens to Karen Read is now in the hands of the jury. It is Friday the 13th, and we just wrapped up day 33 in Karen Read's second trial. Now, despite Bev calling the attorneys and jurors in early today in an effort to be sure that they could start deliberating, there was some kind of holdup at the top of the day, so we still ended up starting late. Now, once they sorted out whatever it was they were talking about, closing arguments began. Both sides get an hour and 15 minutes to give their final story of what the evidence shows to the jury. And normally the prosecution goes first and then the defense, and the prosecution can choose to split their time so that they go after as well. But Hank deferred and let the defense go first, and he spent his entire hour and 15 minutes going after the defense so that he could be the last word before the jury began deliberations. So first up was Alan Jackson for the defense. Now, he starts out with the main thing that he wants the jury to focus on.
There was no collision. There was no collision. There was no collision.
Jackson talked about the jury staring directly at injustice, and they are the last line of defense in a case that was corrupted from the start. Proctor was, of course, one of the topics discussed here. He brought up the text from Proctor, and he reminded the jury of the text where Proctor was joking about looking for nude pictures on Karen Read's phone, and about the text saying the homeowner won't receive any crap since he's a Boston cop. And he reads some of the harsher texts, like the ones making fun of Karen's body and mocking her medical conditions, and the ones calling her offensive words. But when he read them, Jackson said those words out loud so that the jury could feel the impact of the venom behind them. And I think that that was very important because Brennan didn't do that when he read them. He said something about the C word. Jackson said it, and I think it was very impactful. Jackson also reminded the jury that Proctor was fired for misconduct in this case. And he says, if the Massachusetts State Police can't trust him, how can you trust him with this verdict and Karen Read's life? And Jackson points out that all of the evidence the Commonwealth is relying on came through Proctor's hands. Another thing that I think was important here was the breakdown of what it means to have reasonable doubt and an explanation of what moral certainty is. Jackson explains that moral certainty means that you are certain about the entirety of the Commonwealth's case, and likely guilty or probably guilty, that's not enough to meet that standard. He also discussed Higgins as a suspect, bringing up a potential motive with the romantic text and getting ghosted. Then Karen Read shows up with John O'Keefe, all lovey-dovey that night. He plays the waterfall video and says Higgins was clearly upset. And he shows Chris Albert. He says he's trying to calm him down from something. And then he says Higgins makes a gesture toward John that seems to say, come outside. Now, aside from Higgins being a possible suspect that was never looked at, Jackson also focuses on the injuries not being consistent with a motor vehicle collision. He reminds the jury that their own medical examiner wouldn't even label John's death as a homicide. And all of this means there was no collision.
If there was no collision, what are we doing here?
He also threw some shade at Welcher's paint test, and he called it a kindergarten project.
Dr. Dan Wolf did the testing on the taillight. Actual testing, not some ridiculous blue paint kindergarten project.
Jackson also brought up Shannon Burgess and how he came up with a brand new theory during trial. And between that and his resume issues, Jackson asked the jury if they can really believe or trust him. He walks through the evidence, like the arm injuries that he says are from a dog. And then he says they rehomed Chloe and she was gone the next morning. The did I hit him? Could I have hit him was also brought up. He said that this was confusion, not a confession. He says Karen was suffering from extreme grief reaction, and the Commonwealth tried to twist that into a confession. He also says there's no blood or tissue on any of the taillight pieces, and the glass on the bumper didn't match the broken cocktail glass. He also brings up Officer Barrows from Dighton Police Department, and Barrows said the taillight was cracked but not completely broken. And of course, the various investigation issues, including the police not bothering to check the neighbors' ring videos and not going into the house or the garage. And they didn't even investigate the snowplow driver's report of a Ford Edge being parked by the street. But on top of all that, Jackson brings up something that had my jaw on the floor. The defense had asked Bev to give a curative instruction about the way that Hank Brennan questioned Dr. Wolf on those holes in the back of John O'Keefe's hoodie. And the instruction was nothing that actually cleared anything up or showed what really just happened. So if Bev wouldn't handle it, I guess AJ was like, okay, well, I got this.
It was clear what the suggestion was, that the holes in the back of John's sweatshirt were from January 29th. That's the impression that was expected to be left with you. That's the impression that he wanted to leave with you. And that's false. The truth is, the Commonwealth created those holes. They aren't holes from road rash. They weren't made on January 29th. Those are cuttings from the Commonwealth's own crime lab, folks. That's what those holes are. And even with 3 prosecutors, all 3 of them, sitting right there in the room at the time, it had to be the defense to correct that record, to bring out the truth. If we hadn't done that, what impression would you folks have been left with? That's more than negligence. That's dangerous. It's dangerous.
What a moment that was. And in the end, Jackson wrapped it up by telling the jury that they can't let the Commonwealth get away with this. He told them to ask themselves, if they convict Karen Read, would they ever be able to say to themselves, this is justice? And he tells them to find Karen Read not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. Then it's Brennan's turn. Now, he started out by talking about John O'Keefe and how he spent his life helping people as a law enforcement officer and taking in his niece and nephew. And on January 29th, Brennan said John O'Keefe was the one who needed help and that Karen left him to die. He focused on how much Karen had to drink that night and that John and Karen's relationship was toxic and crumbling. Brennan also showed several of the clips from Karen's docuseries and interviews from the past few years. Now, these are clips that we saw during the trial, and he played some of the angry voicemails from Karen and reminded the jury that she called him 53 times that night, but he says she didn't call 911 once. Now, to combat the defense's arguments about Proctor, Brennan said that Proctor had been held responsible for what he did and that his actions had nothing to do with justice in this case. That's a shocking statement to me. Now, in terms of ARCA, he said that Wolf deleted texts, and actually the way he said it, he said that Wolf had a court order for the texts and then deleted them, which is not how that happened. But he said that's what happened. He also brings up using Signal, and he used a lower weight dummy arm, which he would have had to adjust calculations for. He asked the jurors if that was being helpful. And of course, don't forget about the ham sandwich.
And he tells us that he's independent and objective. I asked him about a luncheon, not a big deal, just asking him about it. And he says, I have a sandwich and I stand in the corner until I remind him that we got video footage from a documentarian and he's in one of the scenes.
He closed by saying the jurors have a difficult job and reminded them of the charges. He said that Karen left a man who was kind and generous, and she left him alone to die. Then we got to the jury instructions. Now, this is the part where Bev walks through all of the charges against Karen and explains in depth what the jury must conclude in order to find someone guilty for each. So the first count is second-degree murder. For this, the jury would have to unanimously agree that Karen Read caused John O'Keefe's death and that it was an intentional act that would cause death or serious bodily harm. And that means that the act of moving backwards at a high rate was intentional. The next charge, the second count, is manslaughter while operating under the influence. So in order to prove this one, the prosecution has to show that Karen operated a car on a public road under the influence, that she drove recklessly in a way that created a high likelihood of danger, and that all of those factors caused the death of John O'Keefe. Bev also went through the lesser charges that would also fall under this one, which were involuntary manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and operating under the influence. Now, this one's a little bit different. So each of those has different elements that are involved in it. But what's interesting is that the operating under the influence is basically just like that's a DUI charge. That wasn't on there last year. The reason I find this so interesting is because I think that we heard from jurors' interviews after the last trial that a lot of them thought that because Karen was drinking that there needed to be some kind of something, and they all got hung up on all of the lesser charges. I think it's very interesting that they have this one on here now. And I think that it may end up working in the defense's favor, because if they feel the need to have some kind of conviction for her driving under the influence, then that gives that option. And all of the other ones have something about an actual collision, but this one doesn't. So it kind of gives the option to at least convict for something if this jury is thinking along the same lines as the last one. So the third count is leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. Now, to prove this, the Commonwealth has to show that Karen drove on a public road, she hit John O'Keefe, and then she injured him, causing his death, and then didn't stop her car, and she didn't stop to avoid getting in trouble, basically. Now, once all of the jury instructions were read, it was time to select alternate jurors and a foreperson. So the foreperson is juror number 5, who reporter Christina Rex says is a man and was actually the very first juror to be selected during the impanelment, which is kind of wild. Now, if you remember, during jury selection, the court sat 18 jurors total. There were 6 alternates in case anyone dropped out during the case. And surprisingly, no one did. We didn't even lose one juror this time. So they had kind of like a raffle off about who would be the alternates, aka the jurors who will not be deliberating, by basically pulling numbers out of this old wooden box thing. Can you imagine sitting on a jury panel for 33 days and not being allowed to deliberate? If any of the jurors drop out during deliberation and an alternate has to step in, then they have to completely restart their deliberations. Also, something that was interesting, reporter Sue O'Connell said that there is one juror who took 5 notebooks worth of notes, and that one ended up being an alternate. 5 notebooks worth, and they're not even deliberating. Now, the jurors were sent back to deliberate, and David Unetti tried again to ask the judge to make the verdict form a little less confusing for the second count. Now, with the lesser included charges, he says there are 7 different options to choose for a guilty verdict, but only one that says not guilty. So he requested that each charge have the option of saying not guilty, but that was like, no, we're good. The jurors spent more than an hour and a half deliberating before asking to go home for the weekend. So deliberations will continue on Monday morning. Could we get a verdict on Monday? Maybe. Let me know what y'all think in comments. What is your prediction? When do you think it's going to come in? Now, if you want a breakdown of everything happening in court, be sure to check out 13th Juror Podcast, and we will be back here live on Monday morning at 9 a.m. to continue our verdict watch. I will see you there.